I once met a man whose life had fallen apart quite literally. A series of rash, short-sighted decisions had robbed him of his wife and of his children and had left him abandoned and alone and even jobless. And eventually, in desperation, this man knew there was a bishop who lived nearby, and he decided to visit his house and to ask for help. He was shown in and asked to wait, and minutes later the bishop appeared and asked how he could help. And the man, he started to pour out his life story, started to pour out his sorry tale, a story literally filled with hopelessness and guilt and despair. And having listened for a while, the bishop had an idea. He suggested to the man that he sit and look at his copy of a famous oil painting by Rembrandt. The picture was the return of the prodigal son, which shows the homecoming of the wayward son as recounted by Jesus in his famous parable. For almost an hour, that man sat just looking, staring, gazing at that painting. In the very middle are the hands of the father wrapped round his wayward and regretful son. But the two hands are painted quite differently. The left hand is strong and muscular. It holds the son firmly. The other is gentle, and I almost imagine it patting the son on the back. In the Father's two hands, mercy becomes a reality. Forgiveness, reconciliation, change, new life, all these things are achieved. The man told me that as he sat looking at that picture, it was as though the scales fell from his eyes. For the first time in years, God's healing, tender and forgiving presence seemed real to him, seemed tangible to him. It's almost as if he could reach out and touch these things. He relaxed. He felt at peace. He felt forgiven by a loving God. He felt as though he could forgive himself. And how many of us struggle with that? No longer did he feel trapped by his past. He could see a new chapter and a new hope. He broke down in tears, tears of regret, relief and of homecoming. This story of the prodigal son and the way that story impacted and shaped that man's life in turn reminded me of another story that I heard in the news last month. It was the story about a mother and father who were reunited with their son 24 years after he'd been kidnapped. During that time, both father and mother had searched relentlessly for their boy. And in a video of their reunion, the mum can be heard to say, "My boy, you came back. You came back." Whether we know it or not, we have a dad who is relentlessly looking for us too. A dad who wants nothing more than to welcome us back into his home, into his embrace, the same way as the dad who embraced the prodigal son. What does it mean to be at home? Perhaps home is where you're safe. Home is where you can be yourself. Home is family and friends and love and kindness. Home is a place where, in the give and in the take of relationships, we learn about ourselves, sometimes painfully. Home is where the heart is. And we are invited to be at home, to run into the embrace of our hospitable and homely God. What does that really mean for you, to be at home with God? I know that sometimes when things are going wrong, when we have the rug pulled from under our feet, it can feel as if we're not at home, as if that sense of homeliness and safety has gone. It's like the doors of God's home can be closed against us, and we can suffer. Our own failures can create in us a sense of unworthiness, and these can all make us feel homeless. But you know, that story of the prodigal son is a story of someone who feels just like that. The young man leaves home to explore life, and when the fun finishes and he finds himself homeless in the dirt with nowhere to turn, his mind turns back to home. He doesn't expect to be allowed back in after all he's done, but long before he gets to the front door, he sees his dad who hasn't stopped looking for him. And then he feels his arms embrace him, and then he's welcomed back home. The story of the prodigal son could just as well be called the homecoming son. So when we feel like we've travelled far from God's home, when we're rootless and drifting, when we feel lost, there is always a way back home. A way back to the place where we belong. A way back into God's embrace. A way back into God's home. And I hope that you know that in your minds and in your hearts this morning. Go well.